What you're about to see was never supposed to happen inside Buckingham Palace. A visiting American figure, too impatient to wait, a lone royal guard, trained never to speak, and a single silent move that brought the entire hallway to a standstill. When Trump reached out to slap the guard's rifle aside, he expected obedience. What he got instead stopped him mid-motion. And when the king stepped into view, it was already too late. Now, before we reveal exactly what happened, make sure to hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. Because this story goes deeper than headlines ever could. The rain hit the leaded windows of Buckingham Palace like a quiet drum roll, steady, relentless, almost ceremonial in its rhythm. Outside, the palace courtyard shimmered in silver pools under gas lamps, rain running in veins across the ancient cobblestones. A few discreet black vehicles idled under the porte-cochere, their drivers watching the iron gates where the press huddled in slick poncho, cameras tucked under rain covers like soldiers hiding muskets before a volley. Inside, however, warmth reigned. The state corridor glowed beneath the soft gold of chandelier light, its towering mirrors and cream-coloured cornices catching the glint of polished boots and military regalia. Tonight's reception was private, unofficial by calendar, but politically charged all the same. It was a courtesy gathering, an informal gesture following days of tense trade talks and subtle missteps. Royal protocol required grace. But grace did not come easily to everyone. Near the far end of the corridor, beneath an arched entry flanked by oil portraits of Victorian queens, stood a lone figure, unmoving, unreadable, timeless. A Coldstream guard. He was still as granite, dressed in full ceremonial scarlet, the black bearskin, tall and centered, rifle-shouldered, boots aligned to the tile grooves like the floor had been measured just for him. His left hand curled around the wooden stock of the rifle, the steel bayonet glinting faintly from the wall sconces. A marble bust of Queen Alexandra watched silently from a plinth beside him. He didn't move. He didn't blink. He had been there for 82 minutes. He would remain until relieved. The corridor beyond him, just through the arch, led to the king's inner reception room where Charles III and Queen Camilla were still meeting with a short list of diplomats, aides, and British dignitary. The guard knew the drill. No one passed this line unless formally summoned, not even those who thought summoning was beneath them, and one such man was on his way. Footsteps, quick, agitated, and out of sync with the quiet grace of the palace. Staff in black suits exchanged glances and stiffened. Donald J. Trump, former president, and the most unpredictable guest in the building that night, was rounding the corner. His expression said everything. He wasn't in the mood for tradition. His black overcoat flared slightly as he walked, aides trailing behind trying to keep pace, one whispering frantically in his ear. He waved the man off with a flick of his wrist. He had spotted the archway. He had spotted the guard. And in that moment, the ancient air of the palace shifted slightly, as if the walls themselves were bracing. Trump's stride was unmistakable. Shoulders forward, chin slightly up, impatience pulsing from every step. His presence always had a gravity to it, but here in Buckingham Palace, it clashed rather than commanded. The gilded mouldings, the subtle hush of decorum, the oil paintings that had watched over centuries of monarchs, all of it seemed designed to absorb energy like his, to muffle it. His aides had tried, for hours. They had briefed him on protocols. No unaccompanied movements, no speaking directly to stationed guards, no advancing beyond ceremonial thresholds without escort or invitation. But that wasn't how he operated. "Why are we still waiting?" he barked, to no one in particular, eyes on the archway now just 20 paces ahead. His voice cut through the corridor's silence, sharp and unwelcome. An equerry had already tried to explain, twice, that the sealed briefing documents he'd requested would be presented personally by King Charles at the appropriate time. Trump had nodded, seemingly understanding, then muttered something about wasting time. He had waited long enough. "I'll go get it myself," he said, louder this time, almost daring someone to stop him. A younger aide, a man in his 30s with slick hair and darting eyes, rushed to his side. "Sir, please, just a few more minutes. The king is still—" "I didn't come here to be babysat," Trump snapped, brushing past him. The aides exchanged glances, unsure whether to follow or alert someone higher up. But by the time they moved, he was already halfway to the archway. And there he was, the Coldstream Guard, motionless beneath the carved arch. Trump slowed only slightly, studying the man like a businessman sizes up a hotel concierge refusing a late checkout. He gave a half laugh under his breath. A royal mannequin, he thought. Trump raised his hand and gave a casual wave, more dismissive than polite. "Step aside." No reaction. The guard did not blink, did not flinch. His chin remained level, eyes forward. Trump stopped 2 feet from him. The air between them was suddenly charged, not with words, but with presence. Trump's smile faded. He shifted his stance, then jabbed a finger outward like directing a bellhop. "I said, move." The corridor behind them fell silent. Staff down the hall subtly paused. From around the corner, the distant sounds of the reception dulled. Still the guard didn't move, didn't speak, just a statue with a pulse. Trump's face twitched, not in confusion, but in offence, the kind of offence that builds quickly when a man used to command is met with wordless resistance. "Is this a joke?" He looked over his shoulder. His aides were frozen, caught between duty and damage control. Trump turned back, jaw tightening. And now the dangerous thing happened. Not a calculated step, not a measured question. He moved on impulse. His hand rose, not as a strike, but as a shove, aimed directly at the guard's shouldered rifle. He had stood in that precise position since 1800 hours. Sergeant Ewan Hart, Coldstream Guards. He did not think of his feet or the ache in his right shoulder from the weight of the rifle. He did not blink at the thunder that rumbled faintly outside. He did not shift when the laughter of foreign diplomats echoed faintly from the nearby reception room. Stillness was not passive. It was deliberate. A discipline forged across 7 winters at Wellington Barracks, 2 ceremonial mishaps diffused without a word, and 1 near breach during a state banquet that never made the papers. The Queen once passed within 5 feet of him and did not turn her head, but when she exited, she nodded. That was the moment he remembered most. Not the faces, not the medals, not the applause from tourists, the nod. Silent recognition from a lifetime of earned respect. Tonight was no different, or it wasn't supposed to be. He heard the footsteps coming before anyone else. Too loud, too direct, no formal pattern of escort. Then the voice, recognizable from 100 televised speeches, but stripped of podium polish, abrasive, slurred by ego. And now here he was, Donald Trump, standing directly in front of him, chest puffed, eyebrows drawn in that way that suggested irritation masquerading as command. "Step aside," the American said. Hart did not move. He was not permitted to, not unless a royal protection officer gave clearance or the king's own equerry delivered an override in person. His orders had been clear. No one, under any circumstances, was to pass this archway unescorted. That corridor led not just to the king, but to active working documents, briefings, and confidential papers awaiting signature. Access was not a matter of courtesy, it was a matter of state security. He kept his eyes locked on the invisible point ahead of him, straight through the man's face. Trump raised his voice again. The words didn't register. Hart had trained himself to hear only structure, a shout, a whisper, a command that violated protocol. None of that had yet occurred. He held until the hand moved. Trump's right hand came up, fingers spread, palm turned. It wasn't a punch, or even a shove. It was the kind of arrogant half-slap used by men who saw uniformed personnel as decor, not as individuals. He was aiming directly at the shouldered SA-80 rifle, standard ceremonial issue, polished walnut stock, gleaming fixed bayonet. And in that instant, Ewan Hart moved. 1 step. Perfectly timed. His right boot, black as ink and sharp at the toe, shifted forward and slightly to the side, pulling the rifle just out of reach, but not away. The move was defensive, not retreating. his weight redistributed with the precision of a drill instructor, heels aligned, shoulders squared, the bayonet now angled slightly, catching the light from the overhead chandelier. The effect was stunning. It was not violent, it was not threatening, but it was unmistakably a warning. Trump's hand froze mid-air, inches away, suspended. The guard's face had not changed, but everything else in the room had. The staff behind Trump stopped breathing. The click of distant cameras was the only sound that dared remain. Sergeant Hart held his position. The step was over, but the message had begun. The moment hung in the air like the echo of a shattered wine glass. Trump's hand, suspended in midair, trembled just slightly, not from fear, but from the undeniable fact that he had misread the room. That a man he believed to be ornamental had just proven himself a boundary made of bone and legacy. He stared at the guard, as if seeing him for the first time. This wasn't a tour guide. This wasn't a hotel bellhop. This was a soldier, trained, armed, and assigned by the Crown to hold this exact line. But pride, especially wounded pride, is not easily silenced. Trump's hand began to move again, slower this time. A gesture that was part challenge, part test. He wasn't just reaching for the rifle now. He was reaching to prove he could. But before it landed, the bayonet shifted, just half an inch. Just enough. Its polished steel tip gleamed cold under the chandelier, its angled reflection casting a shard of light directly across Trump's hand. He stopped. The blade hadn't moved toward him. It hadn't threatened. It had simply reminded him, quietly and without words, of the line he was about to cross. For a split second, it seemed Trump might lash out anyway, that the weight of his reputation, of never backing down, of bulldozing rooms like this one from Riyadh to Brussels, would override the danger in front of him. But he didn't. Because Sergeant Hart hadn't flinched. Because everyone behind him, his aides, the palace staff, the security liaisons, stood frozen in the kind of stunned hush that can't be broken without consequence. Because there was something far more terrifying in the guard's silence than in any threat Trump had ever received. Not defiance, conviction. The kind that isn't loud, the kind that doesn't blink. Trump's hand lowered slowly. And that's when the real damage happened. Not to his hand, not to his pride, but to the illusion he carried into every room. That power always makes people move. But here it hadn't. Behind him, the sounds of distant chatter from the reception were muffled by thick walls and high ceilings. Yet even those voices seemed to have softened, as if the architecture itself was watching. Cameras clicked again. Someone, maybe a junior staffer, had recorded it on their phone from the far end of the corridor, half obscured by a pillar. The angle was imperfect, but it caught the frozen tableau. Trump paused mid-stride, the guard, bayonet gleaming. The rifle never lowered, never offered. The image would eventually leak, but not yet. Not before the palace itself responded. From the far hallway, the hush broke. Not loudly, not with sirens or orders, but with footsteps, measured, crisp, echoing in pairs, leather soles on marble, weighted with lineage. And then came the voice. Not Trump's, not the aide's, but the clipped, calm articulation of a royal equerry. "Sir, His Majesty is aware of your presence." The words were not welcoming. They were a statement, a signal, and standing just behind the equerry, in a doorway lined with dark wood and gold trim, was King Charles III. He stepped forward, Queen Camilla at his side, both of them holding that peculiar stillness the monarchy has practiced for generations, the kind that does not react, because to react is to stoop. The king's gaze swept the corridor, not toward Trump, but toward the guard. A beat passed. Charles gave a subtle nod to Sergeant Hart, almost imperceptible, and then, finally, he looked at Trump. The tension in the corridor thickened like steam against stone. Trump stood there, hand lowered now, jaw tight, while King Charles held his gaze with quiet precision. There was no fury in the king's expression, nor smugness, nor even visible disapproval. But there was something far heavier, expectation. The kind that doesn't shout, because it doesn't need to. Behind Trump, His aides hovered in a cluster of panic and paralysis, their mouths half open but offering no words. They had rehearsed contingencies, but none of them had accounted for this. A public confrontation in the most shrouded corridor of British ceremony, with no room left to spin or soften the optics. The silence was deeper than quiet. Even the air seemed to wait. To one side, a small cluster of guests, ministers, palace attachés, a visiting trade envoy from Canada, stood just inside the reception room, caught mid-drink, frozen in mid-toast. No one moved. One woman slowly lowered her champagne flute without a sound. Somewhere, a distant violin had trailed off into silence, because everyone could sense it. Something ancient had been disturbed. And still, the guard did not move. Sergeant Hart remained exactly where he was, rifle still raised, eyes fixed past the former president's right shoulder. His body spoke more clearly than any language. I do not yield, not even now. It wasn't a challenge, it was a principle. It said, I know who stands behind me. I know the weight of my uniform. I know the law I am sworn to uphold. And I know that this line, this very line beneath your shoes, is not yours to cross. Trump shifted. Not much, just a step backward. But it was enough. And in that half step, everything tipped. The court photographer, who had been stationed behind a pillar at the far end of the hall, raised her camera instinctively. She didn't use flash. None was needed. The room, aglow with chandeliers and golden wall sconces, was already lit with the quiet blaze of tradition. She clicked. One photo, then another. Each shutter snap sounded like a bell toll. Everyone knew those images would be studied by morning papers and midnight pundits alike. There would be cropped versions, zoomed-in analyses, Twitter frames, satirical memes, national headlines. But none of them would capture what was happening in that moment, not fully, because this was not about photograph. This was about power, and how sometimes power is not volume, it's posture. Trump turned slightly toward Charles, as if to speak, perhaps to demand the papers he'd come for, perhaps to explain. But before he could open his mouth, a movement behind the king caught his eye. An equerry, a man in a dark coat with the Windsor insignia at his collar, stepped from a side room carrying a leather folio thick with documents. His gloved hands held it carefully, the wax seal still unbroken. These were the very briefings Trump had demanded access to. The reason he had insisted on skipping protocol, on walking unescorted through palace halls, meant only for the Crown's inner circle. They were here, and yet they did not move forward, because the king made no signal. Charles stood still, shoulders square, hands lightly clasped at his waist. He looked at the folio, then back at Trump. There is an order to things, he said, voice calm. When that order is observed, the rest follows. There was no malice in the words, but they landed harder than any reprimand. Trump stared at the sealed documents, inches away, close enough to touch, but completely out of reach. He understood now. This wasn't a negotiation. This wasn't an arena he could dominate. This was an institution, one older than his country, unmoved by bluster, anchored in centuries of exact protocol, and the man with the rifle had become its symbol. The corridor had never been built for confrontation. Its vaulted ceiling, lined with golden floral plasterwork, was meant to echo formality, not friction. But now, standing squarely beneath its arch, King Charles III had assumed control of the space, not by force, not by command, but by presence. To his right, Queen Camilla stood poised, hands clasped gently in front of her. Her expression was unreadable, though there was a faint lift in her brow, as if watching something familiar play out in an unfamiliar room. The Queen had spent her life watching men misread the tone of palaces. Charles didn't speak again. He didn't need to. The silence did the speaking now. Trump was still watching the documents in the equerry's hands, the sealed folio, the prize he had come for. It hadn't moved. The man holding it kept his grip tight, waiting for a cue that never came. The American's mouth opened slightly, perhaps to argue, perhaps to deflect, but the king raised one finger, barely perceptible, more a gesture than a motion. And that was it. The message was crystal clear. You've already said enough. The former president stepped back, the soles of his shoes giving a faint scuff against the polished marble tile. The distance between him and the Coldstream Guard widened by a single stride, but that movement changed everything. It was a retreat. Sergeant Hart did not adjust his stance, but there was the slightest softening around his jaw, a millimeter's release, so refined it could only be noticed by those trained to see it. He had won, and he had never said a word. The equerry holding the folio glanced toward the king. No nod, no motion. The papers remained sealed. Charles then turned to the guard, not with surprise, but with that rare royal gesture of silent commendation, a soft blink, a fractional lowering of the chin. The kind of look a monarch gives, not to a subordinate, but to a peer. Trump saw it too, the subtle nod, the way the king acknowledged the soldier and not the guest. And in that moment, something shifted in the atmosphere, not just in the room, but inside the American himself, because power, when it is real, doesn't need to announce itself. It doesn't demand doors to be opened. It waits, and the world opens for it. Queen Camilla stepped beside her husband, and together they moved past Trump, not brusquely, not dismissively, but as if the situation had concluded and was no longer worthy of additional time. Their exit was quiet, and yet somehow it thundered. Trump remained in place, eyes flicking between the guard, the equerry, and the papers that were now, undeniably, not his to claim. He had stormed the corridor to take control. Now he was left standing in it, excluded by silence. A staff member, perhaps sensing the shift, stepped forward. "Sir, this way," they whispered, gesturing down the hallway. Trump didn't respond, but his feet moved. One step, then two. The corridor stretched ahead of him, suddenly longer than it had seemed minutes before. At the far end, behind frosted glass doors, a camera flash blinked once, then again, faint but perfectly timed. Outside, the press sensed movement. The moment was already leaking beyond the palace walls. The king and queen disappeared behind the carved walnut door to the inner room. The guard resumed his exact posture, rifle up, eyes forward, boots squared. It was as though none of it had happened, but the air said otherwise, and Trump knew it. He had not been shouted at. He had not been thrown out. Worse. He had been stood still against by a man who never even looked him in the eye. The corridor felt heavier now, as if the very air had thickened. The king and queen were gone, disappearing behind the walnut doors like a curtain closing on the final act. But the scene hadn't ended, not for those still standing in the hallway, blinking in the golden light, struggling to process what had just occurred without a single raised voice. Trump stood alone at the center of it all, facing no one and yet surrounded by silence. The aides behind him remained frozen, unsure whether to comfort him or keep their distance. None dared speak. And yet, one figure had not moved, not in action, not in presence, not in posture. The guard, Sergeant Ewan Hart. Still as the statues outside the palace gates, rifle shouldered, bearskin cap, perfectly centered, the faint sheen of rain still drying on his scarlet tunic. His boots remained rooted where they had shifted in that defensive, calculated step forward. Not 1 inch further, not 1 inch less. He had restored the line. Outside, through tall windows trimmed in mahogany, the rain continued to fall across the courtyard. The lights of the press pens cast a faint glow against the mist, and camera flashes flickered intermittently, though none of them yet knew what had just occurred. But they would. Because stories like this don't stay secret in palaces built to be watched. Back in the reception hall, soft classical music resumed, hesitantly at first. Someone uncorked another bottle of wine. Dignitaries whispered, casting sideways glances down the corridor where the scene had unfolded. But the real story remained here, in the silence. Trump slowly exhaled. Not a sigh of relief. More like recalibration. He had misjudged the terrain. And for a man used to dominating boardrooms and podiums, there was no worse sting than finding himself on the wrong side of tradition. He turned to leave, not abruptly, but with the stiff restraint of someone choosing to retreat without using the word. The aides followed. And behind him, the guard did not glance, did not nod, did not acknowledge, because this wasn't personal, this was ceremonial. And tradition, real tradition, doesn't break formation for personality. Trump's shoes echoed down the corridor, growing fainter with each step. Aides peeled off to brief press liaisons and damage control staff. But still, the camera at the far end of the hall remained trained on the figure in red. Because in every palace, there's always someone watching. And this time, it wasn't the cameras that had humiliated a former president. It was a single, silent step. The hallway was nearly empty now, just a pair of custodians whispering as they passed behind a distant column, and the gentle echo of doors closing behind retreating staff. But at the centre of the corridor, beneath the vaulted arch, in the precise line of sight to the king's inner chamber, he remained. Sergeant Ewan Hart. He had not moved. From the moment Trump had approached, to the moment he left, and now, long after the tension had broken like a snapped cello string, Hart remained at post, rifle shouldered, spine like a column, breath controlled. His expression hadn't changed, but something behind the eyes was now visible to anyone who looked closely enough. Not pride, not satisfaction, something older than either, duty. Through the high window behind him, the storm had finally broken. The rain slowed to a whisper, thin trails trickling down the glass. Outside, across the slick stones of the courtyard, a palace press officer gave a low nod, and cameras began to move. The image was already circulating, a single frame. Trump caught in mid-step, his hand hovering uncertainly near the guard's bayonet, the guard unmoving, the light catching the steel, just enough to reflect not violence, but boundary. It wasn't the kind of photo designed to go viral. It was the kind that would be framed in a hallway one day, remembered not for who shouted loudest, but for who stood still. And somewhere deeper in the palace, King Charles was back at work, already engaged with another guest, another moment, another item of royal business. As for Trump, he was gone, escorted back through the receiving halls, his motorcade ready to leave. No handshake, no farewell photograph, no press statement. But none of that mattered now. Because for everyone who had seen it, for every whispering guest, every flashing camera, every aide with their breath held mid-sentence, the moment had already landed. Not with a speech, not with a scandal, with a silence that shut the room down. And at the heart of it, a soldier stood, not for himself, but for something far older, far heavier, and utterly unwilling to yield. Now tell us this, if you were in the guard's boots, would you have taken that step? And do you think Trump should have been allowed past, or did tradition win today? Drop your thoughts in the comments, we read every single one. If you found this story worth watching, make sure to like, subscribe, and tap the bell icon so you never miss a moment. And don't forget to share this video, it's how these untold moments keep reaching others like you. Other powerful stories are now on your screen. Watch them next, and we'll see you tomorrow, same time, with a brand new video.